Topic this time is fate, fortune, and the stars. And our quotation comes from the definitions of Hermes Trismegistus to Asclepius. And that quotation is, there is a law above destiny. Something that's brought out in the rest of the Hermetica too, and also in the Pistis Sophia. So Egypt had its own astrological tradition and even a house system before the influences Babylonian and otherwise, also Greek. So in Egyptian astrology, as it existed back during the time of Hermeticism, so let's say 1st to 3rd, maybe 4th centuries Common Era, there were a number of fateful influences that astrologers were hired to warn us about. So let me go over that part first, and then we'll talk about the rest. The fateful influences, this is just a couple of examples. So the Hermetic idea is that there's a god called omniform or pantomorphous, and you think of it as the god of the horoscope, that makes the forms of earthly beings at the start of our lives, so hence our natal chart, through the decans. So what are decans? The ecliptic is the apparent path of the planets across the sky, as seen from the standpoint of Earth. So because that path is a circle, it has 360 degrees. The decans are 10-degree segments along that circle, that celestial circle. And so for the Egyptians, the decans themselves were a kind of entity, a kind of time god. And each one had a different character, personality, and influence. So the decans, according to ancient Egyptian thought, had a lot to do with how we land on this planet. So that's one fateful influence from above. Another is the signs of the zodiac. They can be powers that torment us and make us suffer through our bodily senses. According to book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum, for example, and also the Pistis Sophia, they have a certain sway over us physically, and we'll come back to that because that's an important point. And then, in the same pool at that time was Hellenistic astrology, which tends to be kind of deterministic, and a lot of emphasis there on planetary transits. So, at a given time, let's say that in the sky, Mars, and you can think of aggression, warlikeness, all those things that Mars is associated with, squaring Pluto, which is the god of underworld, huge transformation, often painful, death and rebirth. Pluto is an energy of resurrection. So when those get together, the underworld god and the war god, sparks fly. And an astrologer looking at those would, of course, look at all the other influences that are happening during that moment in time. But with that particular transit, might say there's going to be something violent breaking out. Mars square Pluto, and squares are tough. They're tougher than oppositions. So a conjunction is a fairly harmonious aspect. It means two planets are talking to each other. An opposition at least holds forth the possibility that you can balance the two energies of the planets. A square is hard. You have to somehow exert conscious energy to make the two planets of the square get along with each other and talk to each other, and the tension doesn't decrease. So bear in mind that through all of this, it's held, well, some people held it causally, but for the most part, astrologers themselves, especially these days, hold it more like a synchronicity, as Jung would call it. It's not causal. So, you can go into YouTube or anywhere else and see endless videos of materialistic scientists debunking astrology by saying, Mars doesn't make people angry. And it's a straw man argument. They haven't done their homework. They have no idea what they're talking about. That's not what the claim is. The claim is that in a given moment of time, there are parallels between the transits and stuff that's happening down here. And it's complicated by your own life circumstances and where your chart is and all the rest of it. So this has been a wisdom path, astrology, for thousands of years in different cultures. So from a Hermetic perspective, the overarching structure was known as the harmonia. And that refers to the cosmic framework that's moved by fate, and also in some stories by the spirit of the demiurge, the kind of lower god that creates the cosmos, sort of a workman employed by the big mind or big mystery. And you can see some of this in the discourse on the 8th and the 9th, which is one of the Hermetic documents that was recovered with the Nag Hammadi findings in 1945. So this all sounds pretty grim. It sounds like determinism, but there's another side to this. And before we get there, let me make a comment about determinism, because determinism has a certain psychological value. There's a comfort in determinism. And even astrologers who should know better sometimes speak deterministically. Oh, this transit is, you're going to have a hell of a time when this happens. You know, that's determinism. And one of the gains emotionally of determinism is that it relieves us of the responsibility of becoming better people. If it's all up to the planets, there's nothing you can do, right? So there's a certain relief factor in determinism. But that's not where Hermeticism stops. So in the Hermetic way of looking at this, consciousness, as I've mentioned before, is directly tied to big mind. It can bypass the gods. And it can actually go up to cosmologically what's known as the 8th sphere, the sphere of the fixed stars, and even beyond that. So there's 7 zones in antiquity that correspond with lower reality. It's also called the hebdomad in Gnosticism. And then above that is the realm of the fixed stars, and above that is spiritual reality, the ennead, the 9th level. And so it's possible to do that and get rid of the influence of the 7 planets, the governors, as they're called, the governors of fate, by gaining access to the abode of spirit beyond all of them. Now, how do we do this? It's a pretty tall order. We do this here by discerning and working with and seeing through these planetary influences and transits. The stars, according to the Hermetic understanding of a couple of almost 2,000 years ago, may control our bodies and physical reality to some extent, but they don't control our mind, soul, or spirit. They don't relieve us of responsibility for how we respond to these transits. And it's a matter of experience among many people who do astrology professionally, that when there's a tough transit and you've done your homework on what it represents in your life, it tends not to show up outside you as much. There's a Jungian component to that too. Jung talks about how when an archetype is constellated, if we're not really working with it, if we haven't really integrated the message, it tends to show up outside us and look like fate. But there's something we can do about that. We can learn the lessons, we can get the message, and then we have a different experience. So I sometimes think of this when, as is up for my life pretty soon now, the Saturn return, the dreaded second Saturn return. And people have so much negative things to say about it. Saturn is the planet of heaviness and depression and too much structure and rigidity and all these negative things. And we forget that in mythology, Saturn is also the bringer of the golden age and the harvest. So if you've learned your Saturn lessons, then you might have more of that kind of experience during that long passage than having it all show up outwardly as all kinds of limitations. I guess we'll find out. So the good news in all this is that the last word is with us. Fortune, understood this way from a Hermetic perspective, is what we make of what we are given, and not even the gods can prevent that.